Star Trek will not be presented tonight, so that we may bring you the following special program.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners. Armin Shimerman, welcome to Word Balloon. Long time coming, sir. Long time fan, and I'm so glad to be able to talk to you today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Not only a fan, certainly, of your role as Quark on Deep Space Nine, but I want to say off the bat, Brooklyn Bridge. I'm so sorry that show didn't get to continue beyond its 2 seasons. The entire ensemble was terrific, and I love. You were Cousin Bernie, right?
That's right. And it's a very important show in my career and in my life. Brooklyn Bridge is what resurrected my desire to act. So we can talk a lot about Brooklyn Bridge. I am very fond of it. And the show was extraordinary. The people on it were incredible. Amy Aquino, who was on it, became my business partner. Marion Ross is my God.
Wow. That's really great. Because again, yeah, I mean, right off the bat, 2 fantastic co-stars. The kids were great without being overly precocious. I mean, the whole thing, it just felt so natural. And also, anyone who has an immigrant background as far as their family, I think can relate. I'm a Greek person, and my big fat Greek wedding certainly resonated with me. But truly, it's like, oh, I had relatives like that. I had cousins and grandparents and things like that. God, Louis Zorich was so fantastic in it too.
Yeah, Louis was terrific. Married to Olympia Dukakis and brother-in-law to my good friend Apollo Dukakis. Yes, he was terrific, and I all of them were a dream to work with. And as I said, I was ready to quit the business until Brooklyn
Yeah.
Bridge came.
Wow. So really, what were you just felt like you were typecast, or what
Oh no,
what was your
just the
frustration?
opposite. It was just the opposite. Typecast means that you can't get any work but one particular kind of work, and that would have been nice. No, at that point in my career, things were dying, and I wasn't getting much work. And I took a good look at myself and said, I'm probably not the person who should go into this business and stay in this business. I had already done a great deal of work, but I asked myself, should I stay in this? I was close to being 40 years old. I think I was 39 and a half, and was seriously considering giving it up because there just didn't seem to be any future. And then out of the blue, truly out of the blue, I hadn't auditioned for the show. The agent called and said they'd like to offer you a part on Brooklyn Bridge. And I had, at that point in my career, never been offered a role. I always had to audition, always. So to be offered a role was extraordinary. And then I thought it was going to be a one-time thing until I read the script, and it said that I was a nephew to Marion Ross's character and Louis Zorch's character. And then I thought, well, there may be some future to that. And I think I ended up doing about 6 episodes of Brooklyn Bridge. I probably would have done some more, but after a year or so of doing Brooklyn Bridge, I had the good fortune to audition for Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which was right across the street, literally yards away from where they were shooting Brooklyn Bridge. And I'm quite sure that the confidence that I acquired from working on Brooklyn Bridge was instrumental in my having confidence when I auditioned for Quark. The two, in my mind, go hand in hand.
And yet very different characters and
Very good.
playing
It's
to
just the
different parts of your
confidence of
strength.
knowing I can do it,
Okay.
capable of doing it. I certainly was used to being on the Paramount lot, and it just gave me a great deal of confidence. Whereas prior to doing Brooklyn Bridge, I had really lost my confidence.
Wow. Well, also being cast in Deep Space Nine, a chance for you to because I've heard you talk before on other interviews and convention panels about your initial performances as a Ferengi on Next Generation and the way they were written initially and so one note.
No,
So yeah,
the
tell me about it.
Ferengi were certainly written one-dimensionally, but I didn't help it any. You've heard me say this before, and I will continue to say this forever because I'm enormously embarrassed by that performance. The Klingon, excuse me, the Ferengi were meant to be the new Klingons
Hmm.
on Next Generation, and I failed miserably. And I've always been embarrassed that particular performance is perhaps the worst performance I ever gave. Now, it turned out very, very, very well. I'm not complaining about that, but I spent 7 years on Deep Space Nine atoning for that one performance on Next Generation.
How much input did you have? Because, God, the great thing is the Deep Space Nine writers really went beyond Quark being the shady business guy that obviously didn't agree with the Federation rules. And you had romances. I mean, and really early on, I loved your episode with Mary Crosby that essentially was like a Casablanca
Right.
kind of episode. But yeah, I mean, did you give that to them? Did you say I want to be more than just a con man? Yeah, tell me.
No, early on in the show, I did not think that had any leverage and could not say that to them. And all I knew, I didn't know where the character should go. I had no inclination about that whatsoever. All I knew was I wanted to inject some sort of nobility into the character. And that's a strange adjective or noun connected with Quark. But because of the ludicrousness of my performance on Next Generation, I knew that I wanted to make Quark as three-dimensional a character as I possibly could, and I had very strong memories of my friend Data saying, I asked him, "What do you want to do with Data?" And he said, "I want to take the character with the least amount of potential and make him the character with the most amount of potential." And that was my guiding light for the creation of Quark. But I had no personal say. What I did have was, as the writers watched dailies and watched me perform, they must have gotten intuitions into where I wanted the character to go. And so nothing verbal was said, but performances sort of steered them in the direction that I was hoping that they would go.
I've heard you say when you performed Quark, the teeth were really instrumental in getting the character. Is that an
That
apt
is true.
description?
The sound of my voice was slightly altered by the teeth. Although, if you look at the first episode of Deep Space Nine, the 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 voice quality of Quark is immensely different than the next 7 years. In that first episode, I used the same voice that I used from Next Generation, and I had done, I believe, two different Ferengi at that time on Next Generation. So I love a woman in uniform was the voice quality that I used on the first episode. And Rick Berman, bless his heart, called me into his office and said, lose the voice. And so the voice became mine just with the appliances in my mouth. So he had sort of a Humphrey Bogart sort of sound to him because I had appliances in my mouth.
Was acting through the makeup and the masks, and I know you and Renee were guys that obviously had to deal with that as far as the way you looked on camera. Did you think that was an advantage or to evoke your emotions, or was it harder?
Not to evoke emotions, it was a freeing effect. It allowed me to do outrageous things that I wouldn't have the heart to do without the makeup, sort of like wearing a lampshade at a party. Um, but one of the epiphanies I had was perhaps for the first 4 or 5 or 6 episodes, I thought, well, he's an alien. I need to do something that makes him an alien. And then one day, while I was in my trailer peeing into my urinal, where there was a mirror over the sink, I realized, look at that. You really do look like an alien. This is why it came to me after 5 or 6 episodes. I don't know, but there I was, and I looked at it. I went, I don't have to do anything. The makeup does that for me. I just have to be as real, as human, as three-dimensional one-dimensional as I possibly can be, and I don't have to play an alien. The makeup does that for me.
Were there certain writers that you felt really tapped into Quark, and when you'd get a certain episode and be like, man, this guy gets it, or this woman gets it?
There were two. They were both male writers, and that was Ira Bear
Sure.
and Robert Hewitt Wolf. I attribute the Ferengi arc to them,
Hmm.
and it was they weren't just working with Quark; they were working with Rom, they were working with Nog. They were
Yep.
so that, and they were very interested in creating the Ferengi culture. I believe in the same way that Ron Moore had created the Klingon culture.
I get it. And yes, absolutely apparent. Um, Again, and forgive me for referencing other, times you've told these stories at different conventions and other interviews and stuff. But I loved hearing that you would gather all the Ferengi actors for specific like group reads to really, I think, maybe, obviously play off each other and then really create the dynamics that we saw on screen.
Yes, to create the dynamics is exactly why we met. We also had it was selfish of all of us as well because we knew after a while that we needed to have that extra rehearsal time in order to get through the last 3 or 4 hours of each day. Most of our days, including the makeup time, was probably about 16 hours a day.
Oof.
And about hour 11 or so, we would fade. It was just being encased in the prosthetics for as long as we were. It's like having a head cold. You just began to fade. Just your mind didn't work the way it had in the morning, and you just couldn't think straight. And you were drinking as much coffee as you could to stay awake. So that rehearsal time was like rehearsing a play, and we could get through the last hours of the day because we had rehearsed it. And the dynamics was also important because I am instinctually and by profession a theater actor more than a camera actor. And so were most of the actors who worked with me. That rehearsal time was second nature to us, and we knew we could make better choices if we rehearsed it together as an ensemble. I've always been an ensemble player. I've never thought of myself as an individual looking for acclaim or anything like that, but rather just one of the members of the group. And so by getting the group together, that gave me advantages that I wouldn't have had if I had simply showed up on the set at 7 o'clock in the morning and known my lines and wondered what the other people were going to do. Knowing what the other people do was enormously influential in what I did. There's a
Sure.
saying in our business, which is all life comes from the other person. And so by knowing what the other people were going to do, essentially, I could prepare myself for that day's work.
How quickly did you find rapport with Max when he was playing Rom and you were Quark?
I found rapport with Max prior to even being cast.
Really?
Yes, Max and I were both auditioning for Quark,
Yes.
and I believe he was the runner-up. And while we were auditioning, I sort of took him aside and asked him about his approach to the character, and I revealed my approach to the character. And we sort of bonded on that day during auditions when we were both up for the role. So when it seemed pretty obvious that one of us was going to play Quark and one of us was going to play Rom. And so from that first day of the audition, I bonded with Max. And Max, I've said this 1,000 times and still mean it. I could not have gotten through the 7 years of Deep Space Nine without Max. Max was my rock, my staff. He was there. He got me through things. He entertained me. He was giving, kind, all the things that you want from a fellow actor.
And what about the inclusion then of Aaron? And I'm so sorry that he's not with us anymore. We all loved him as fans. Can you talk about Aaron and maybe give us a good story about Aaron?
I had less of a rapport with Aaron. I had a great rapport with Aaron, but less of a rapport with Aaron than I did with Max because Max and I worked as a unit over and
Hmm.
over again. I worked with Aaron lots, but he was always tangential to the to the relationship of the two brothers.
Yes.
But when Aaron was the joy of the company, whenever Aaron showed up, there was fun, there was gaiety. He made us laugh over and over and over again. He was always full of spirit. He was a wonderful actor, and he imbued wonderful, wonderful things into the character of Nog. Uh, but when the cameras weren't rolling, he kept us all entertained. He was delightful. And yes, his parting, his heart attack, is a loss to not only us who worked with him, but for all of his fans, and there are thousands, countless fans of Noggs.
Yeah, I'm one of them. That's it was tragic. It really was. Man, another loss too. And I want you to say Renee's last name because I'm sure I'll get it wrong.
Yes, I often do it at conventions. Auberginois.
Or Bergenois. There you go.
Bergenois. Yeah.
The
It's
original
not
Father
French.
Bouquet, you
Yeah,
know.
the Richard Bonamaki, exactly. Uh, and he's not French, he's Swiss. His grandfather was Swiss and a great abstract painter. In fact, there are paintings of René Auberginois, his grandfather, that hang in the d'Orsay in Paris.
Wow. That's crazy. First of all, I loved and I kicking myself. I never had the opportunity to get an autograph from Renee because he would draw the bucket
Mhm.
and put a little thought bubble over it saying, whoever the fan was, and hi Jerry, Renee,
Yeah.
which
No,
was
all the
great.
money that he collected for those particular signatures went to charity.
That's terrific. I'm going to ask
Yeah.
you about your charity when we wrap up, because that's great. And that's one of the high marks of all you Star Trek people, man. You give back, and I think that's I mean, you gave us a lot with your performances, and it's pretty amazing that that's part of the edict. It seems for the Star Trek casts
Well,
and
we're
crew.
very fortunate because the majority of people who are Star Trek fans are enormously charitable. And so realizing that we can make a difference by reaching out to our fandom, who are always ready to give, we're in a very lucky position. We can help the charity, and at the same time, we can help the people who are donating because they feel very good. The great thing about the Star Trek fandom is the inclusion, is the desire for a better future. And one of the ways to make a better future is to help with charities.
Agreed. While we stuck with Renee for a second, again, an amazing Louis and bogey sort of Casablanca relationship, the constable and the criminal,
Hmm.
and uh, and I think of the Ascent, where you guys really got to get into each other's faces, but always there was this undercurrent of both characters really did care for each other, and you're especially they gave you some great moments of real concern about Odo when his relationship with Kira and everything I thought was great. So tell me, again, did you and Renee do that same thing of really getting together and figuring out the dynamics?
Yes, that's actually the question of the chicken or the egg. It's the egg that is the answer for this relationship. Renee and I were not particularly fond of each other at the very beginning. We had worked together on a play where we had very little to say to each other. It's not that we didn't like each other. It's that we were never in the same scene together in the play, so we didn't really have much of a rapport. Um, and but that all changed while we started to do Deep Space Nine, mainly because, um, and this relationship might have been majorly different, but we were seated next to each other in makeup chairs that were only about a foot apart. And because we each had long makeup, we began to communicate, to bond, and we found that we had many friends in common, and and we had many experiences in common. Although I don't want to equate my career with Renee's. Renee is one of the princes, was one of the princes of the American theater. He was a god. When you talk to theater people about great actors, Renee is always one of those people that they talk about. And I always had a great uh, awe of his ability on stage. But as we began to bond in the makeup chairs, our admiration for each other began to grow and grow. And as I was saying about dailies before, about my own performance, I think the writers began to sense that there was a growing love between these two actors who, on the paper, were supposed to hate each other. And they began to realize that they needed to write for that, which they did. Our writers are incredible people, great writers, and they knew what was happening. And so they wrote for us. And we brought that as much as we would bicker in front of the camera, our intrinsic love for each other shone through.
That's terrific. And yeah, the writers, well, my God, what they've done since Star Trek speaks for itself. A lot of them are showrunners now of their own programs, and yeah, I think some of
And
the
a lot
best
of them were
writing.
young writers. At that time, I think we were the only program around where unknown writers could submit scripts and
Yes,
actually get them chosen to be episodes. And many of the now showrunners that you were just alluding to were one of those young writers who were submitting scripts, and they got their start by writing for Star Trek.
that's terrific. Really. How is it coming back for Lower Decks?
Well, it was lovely. It was also very flattering. Um, I have always lived with the belief that our show was overshadowed by the two shows that surrounded us. So
Sure.
Next Generation was doing movies and was a great success. Voyager was the opening or was the anchor episode for New Network. Uh,
Yep.
Paramount was interested in those two shows and wasn't all that interested, in my belief, with Deep Space Nine. And so over the years, we sort of got lost in the shuffle. When Lower Decks offered Nana and I the roles that we had played before, uh, I felt enormously flattered. I thought, oh, here's someone that recognizes the worth of Deep Space Nine and wants to do something about it. So I was enormously flattered and grateful. And it was not only a tribute to Nana and I, but I truly believe it's a tribute to all the people that were part of Deep Space Nine, whether they were on camera or off camera, whether they were the series regulars or the supporting cast or the guest stars, and nothing was more indicative of that fact than the opening sequences of that episode where they played music and we went around the station a couple of times.
Absolutely. Great stuff. I also love the idea that Quark his business thrives and now he's franchised the idea of Quarks, which is fantastic. I was in Vegas when the Star Trek experience was happening and you could buy a drink and have lunch at Quark's bar. And
And be served by your very own Ferengi. Absolutely.
indeed, absolutely, man. No, I felt I was there. I was looking for you. That was uh that was amazing. And my God, these sets were gigantic for your
Yes,
show, weren't they?
and they were different than any sets I had ever been on. Usually sets on sound stages are all divided up, and there's no real connection between one set and another. You just work on one set and then they stop shooting and then you move to the next set
Sure.
and you start shooting there. But on Deep Space Nine, the promenade was one huge, colossal piece of scenery. And so everything was exactly as you saw it on camera. You could indeed walk from Quark's to Odo's office. You could indeed walk from Quark's up to the second level and look out at the stars. It was one huge e-ride for all of us.
Pretty cool stuff. When Michael Dorn joined the cast, a new foil for Quark, in some ways similar to Odo, but really again, well, Michael brought his own thing. Was that like weird? Because as you say, the next gen cast was already in movies, and the Deep Space Nine cast, or rather the Voyager cast, was coming on UPN. But yeah, was it like, hey, what's do we need this guy?
Well, I think actually you've said something that uh, is exactly what I thought, but I want to go into an explanation about it. Um, right now, of all the people I work with, Michael Dorn is probably one of my closest friends, and I see him more than I see him more than anybody else from Deep Space
That's
Nine.
great.
Now that Renee has passed, um, but I did feel, because again, my impression was that we were always in the shadows and that we were not doing as well as Next Generation, or later on as Voyager, and so they needed to bring on, and I felt badly about this, they needed to bring on someone from TNG to help this struggling show along. So that's the attitude I had, was I wasn't really particularly happy that they were bringing on a character from TNG to help us, to be a crutch for us. But then Michael matriculated into our cast very well, and I got over that, I think, in a very short period of time. Michael and my friendship grew and grew and grew, so I was very fond of Michael very quickly. But in the beginning, I felt it was unnecessary.
Like Woody Harrelson joining the Cheers cast, it was just like this unexpected, pleasant surprise that really became important. And again, the way that he connected with all the other characters and stuff. What about Terry Farrell? And really, of course, not only Terry Farrell but Nicole DeBoer, Dax, and Quark. I think had a great relationship that ironically only evolved when Terry left, but Nicole came on as Ezri.
Yeah, I think Quark had more of a relationship with Terry than with Nicole. Both actresses are equally beautiful and wonderful to work with, and I like them both. But because Terry was there for 6 years, you can imagine my Quark's relationship with Dax uh, was a deeper one, and and she has some wonderful comments to Kira and others about the the um, the importance and the better side of the Ferengi. She's an advocate for the Ferengi to Starfleet, for which I always appreciated. And we had several scenes where we were playing Tango or some card game together, and there the characters bonded because of that. So I'm very fond of Dax, and then Esri. Yes, Nicole was a great asset to us, and we were sorry to lose Terry, but that was understandable. But understanding what had happened, and that was more of a. Well, I won't go into why it was. That's something that Terry needs to tell you, not me.
Sure.
And uh, but the Esri Dax was a new character, and it was like a new toy for the writers to play with. And so Esri became central to then a preponderance of the episodes in our seventh season. So she didn't spend that much time with Quark because she was really spending a lot of time with everybody else. Um, and as much as I enjoyed having Nicole around, I did feel closer to Terry's Dax than to Nicole's Dax.
One episode in particular that I loved, and it was funny. I was even looking at a 10 best Quark episodes on some blog list, and they didn't list this one where Quark goes to work for his cousin and becomes the arms dealer.
Yeah.
And we got that, and I forget the actor's name, but he was in Beverly Hills Cop, the first one, as the bad guy. And the two of you, and really that guy just came in and really owned that character and made you pay attention. But I just thought everything that you went through in that episode and rubbing up against him was just some of the best Quark moments for me. What'd you think of that episode?
I I had I don't want to say I had a good time on that episode because that character actor whose name I should remember.
Oh,
Uh,
shame on us. I apologize.
yes, we should both remember, and apologies to him because not only is he a very well respected actor, but also a very well respected playwright as well.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, he's a huge playwright. Anyway, he has a reputation for being volatile, and he was rather volatile off camera. And so I spent that week babysitting him, making sure that he didn't explode. He gave a wonderful performance. He always does. But a lot of my performing with him was the sense both of respect for his career, but also making sure that I made sure that he didn't explode, that he was a volcano about to explode. So there's a lot of that intrinsic in my relationship with him, and our relationship grew as I babysat him for 8 days.
Stephen Burkoff,
Thank
ladies and
you,
gentlemen.
Stephen Burkoff. It is. He is a brilliant playwright and a brilliant actor, and is known for his volatility.
Wow, and I know Lawrence Tierney had his brief role on that episode as well. And sadly, I mean, I'm a massive fan, but I would imagine, I mean, the gentleman's reputation is quite a handful, was kind of notorious. How was it working with Lawrence Tierney?
Uh, that was one of the most unique experiences I ever had. Uh, Whereas the one I could babysit and keep him from exploding, Mr. Tierney did explode over and over again, and whether it was his age or whether it was his attitude, I cannot tell. He didn't have one word of the script memorized,
Wow.
and uh, Sid, who was the director, uh, Alexander Siddig, um, had to feed him every word, word by word, as the camera rolled. Sid would say the line, and then Lawrence Tierney would repeat the line, and he was exploding constantly, and not in a good way. Um, and that I've never, in all, I've done a lot. I'm very grateful for that, but I've never worked with an actor who was that. There's no other word for it. Ugly to work with.
Wow. I understand. I mean, again, I'm an old Hollywood buff, and I've heard many stories throughout his career, not only in his later years, but even earlier years and stuff. I mean, Seinfeld and Reservoir Dogs. He played Joe, the crime boss, and everything.
Mm.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, as difficult as those 8 days were, Sid and you guys really pulled it off because again, I think it's a real memorable episode. I think it's great.
It is that, and I was very happy for the storyline. Aside from all the things I've just told you, it was a very good storyline for Quark, and I very much appreciate that they wrote it.
And again, man, they treated you well. The House of Quark, where you face the Klingons, and you Grilka, your Klingon love interest. Another fantastic episode, and intrinsic to the Ferengis and Quark's mind, that he could kind of outsmart the Klingons and beat them with their brute force, and be the winner.
Again, a tribute to the writers because they did that. The Klingons aren't that hard to outwit. Um, but um, but they gave me great scenes, and I got to work with my old friend Bob O'Reilly, who played Gowron.
Sure.
And so that was a delight as well. Yes, I had a lovely time doing that. I there's only one episode that I think they failed me on, and that's one called Profit and Lace. But that's only because Quark became a woman. Have no problem with that whatsoever. It's just that he became a woman and didn't learn anything from it. That's what I dislike about the episode.
Oh,
But the
interesting.
other episodes are scrumptious. They're and delicious, and I'm very grateful for them.
Now that was another great well, and I can appreciate that in terms of your frustration with the episode, but it showed the Ferengi ensemble at their best. Wallace Shawn, tell me about Wallace Shawn.
Wally is phenomenal, and the only time I've ever been jealous of another actor on the set was working with Wallace Shawn because he was so incredibly good, not only on camera but off camera. He too is a very famous American playwright, and so
Yes.
I was very much in awe of having him there. He's also the sweetest, kindest man, and in, incredibly good and so dedicated to whatever he's doing. And his stories about acting, about writing, kept me enthralled for 8 days. I didn't babysit him for 8 days; he babysat me.
That's great. You mentioned that Siddig directed the weapons episode. I really enjoyed during COVID, you all getting together on Sid's YouTube channel and doing that kind of sequel DS9 story, and you and Nana and Sirach was on there as well.
Andrew
But yeah,
Robinson.
who? Oh yeah, of course, yes, Andrew. Yeah, indeed. So yeah, tell me about that experience.
Well, that was delightful because we had not, this is before Lower Decks for us. So we
Yes.
had not been back in our character's skin for decades. And so it was delightful. And I've forgotten the writer's name. He was very good, but he knew the characters very well and came up with some delicious things to say and do. And it was sheer delight to do it. And of course, working with my old friends again was icing on the cake. And in that case, as opposed to Lower Decks, where Nana and I individually worked, we were fed lines, but not necessarily by the actors who were saying them,
Hmm.
but we responded with our character lines. But in working with Sid, we all worked as a unit. It was like doing a reading of a play. And so that was nice to have them there and to work with them. And I remember just being enormously nostalgic to hear Andy and Nana and Sid playing their parts again. It was like revisiting old friends from your childhood.
I spoke to Andy last year, and there's one scene in particular that you had with him. I want to say it was in that Way of the Warrior first episode with Michael joining the cast,
Mhm.
where you both are discussing the Federation and how the
That was
contempt you have.
the root beer scene. Yeah.
The root beer scene, absolutely, man. Tell me about it. Yeah.
Well, that was also an interesting scene. Um, you've picked on some of my unique moments on Deep Space Nine. Uh, like the Ferengi, Andy was very willing to come to my house and rehearse that scene and other scenes with me, so that again we would know what we were doing with each other. I also have to say, Andy is an old theater expert, has done lots and lots of plays, and was at one time the most prolific, I think, director of plays in Los Angeles. He directed my wife in a play. He directed me in a play. All of this before Deep Space Nine. And so Andy and I and Kitty and Irene are very, very close friends. So Andy was willing to come and rehearse, and we rehearsed the root beer scene and delved into it, and we found layer upon layer there. And when we went in on Monday to do the scene, um, our director asked us to read it, which is the norm. And when we finished, he said that wasn't very funny. That this is a funny scene. You guys aren't funny. And Andy and I said, well, Jim Conway was the director. We said, Jim, we don't think it's that funny. We think there's a lot of undertones here that we want to play. We don't want to play the overt humor of it. And um, um, so Jim was caught in a bind. His producers had told him he had to direct it a certain way, and his actors were telling him they didn't want to do it that way. So we had to call he had to call the producers down to the stage for them to decide. And when Ira and Robert came down to the stage, they asked what the problem was, and it was explained to them. And then Ira said, "Can you do it our way?" And Andy and I are good actors, and so of
Sure.
course we do it your way, absolutely. And we did it, not on camera, just for them. And then they said, and then Ira and Robert said, "So how do you guys want to do it?" And we showed them what we wanted to do. And Ira and Robert huddled for about 15, 20 seconds at the most, and turned to Jim Conway and said, "Shoot it Armin and Andy's way." And that's the only time in the 7 years that I ever used my leverage to ask to do it a way that I wanted to do it. And then, in fact, they were so taken with what we had done with the scene that the scene that you see, that everyone else sees, is not that original scene. They rewrote it to highlight some of the things that we brought to that original scene. What are the differences? I can't remember. I just know when I see the root beer scene, I know it's very close to the way we wanted to do the scene.
Outstanding. That's great, man. Very cool. I know again your background that you've trained, and I don't know if you still do, and I'll ask you, uh people in Shakespearean plays and how to perform Shakespeare. And also I know your deep theater background as well. Didn't you and Frakes didn't you guys have a theater experience before you
Yes.
guys all
Yes.
got involved with Star Trek?
Oh my God, decades before Star Trek. Uh, uh, Jonathan and I think we're in our 20s. when we belonged to the Impossible Ragtime Theater, which was a very important off-Broadway, off-Broadway theater in New York City. I don't think Jonathan was 25 years old yet. I may have been about 26 or 27. And we never acted together, but because it was a group, because it was an ensemble, we certainly knew each other. And and in fact, when I was cast as Quark, but they had not yet accepted the assignment, I had a long chat with Johnny to ask him about, you know, whether I should do it or not, and he was adamant that I should, and he was right, of course.
um, your involvement with Shakespeare, it informed your Illyria novels. Is that
That's
fair?
right. Yeah.
Tell us
For
about the
those of you,
Illyria novels. Yeah.
yeah. Well, first let me point out that I went to college, started as a poli sci major, and then encountered a phenomenal teacher named David Rhodes, who was my Shakespeare teacher many times over.
Okay.
And he introduced me to Shakespeare, and I had already done some Shakespeare in high school, and just became enormously excited about reading it and acting it. And then immediately after graduation, in fact, prior to graduation, I was hired by a very prestigious Shakespeare festival in San Diego, the Old Globe, to do Shakespeare. And I found I had an affinity for the work. Um, and so I got into show business, if we can call it that, by doing Shakespearean plays. And eventually I had several wonderful Shakespearean acting teachers who taught me more and more about it. But in the meantime, I became somewhat of a dramaturge. I began to explore the language, its meaning, its connotations, its undertones. And I became more and more involved. And so I began to study Shakespeare every day for years. And then I became a teacher. I taught at various theaters around Los Angeles, in fact, around the country. And then eventually I was hired by the University of Southern California to be a Shakespeare scholar, teacher, professor
Wow.
there. And I did that on the collegiate level. But while I was working on Deep Space Nine, this is prior to my being a professor, um, I began to write the Illyria novels. And because I wanted to take the learning that I had acquired over the years and put it into something concrete. And it took about 20 years to compose the story. And then, ironically, when I sold Illyria to Jumpmaster Press, where if anyone is listening and they're interested in reading my novels, they should go to jumpmasterpress.com where they'll be able to get them. Or you can go to amazon.com. But they said to me, you don't have one book, you have three books.
Wow.
And so then I had to rewrite the story in order to incorporate two different endings for book one and book two, and then kept the original ending for book three.
And your character, Dr. Lee, this is a real person.
Yes, that's right.
He's not a
Uh,
doctor?
it's not Lee. It's D. It's with a
Pardon
D.
me.
It's quite all right. John D. Dr. D is a real person, and in fact is associated with Shakespeare. We're not sure how close, but there are suggestions that that he may have been part of the design of the Old Globe, the original Old Globe, in London. I took the idea that he may have. We know that Shakespeare had books to read. Books were very hard to come by at that time, and they were enormously expensive. And there were no public libraries, of course. So if one wanted to read the classics, one had to find someone who owned those books and ask permission to read in people's homes the books that people wanted to read. And the premise is that perhaps Shakespeare himself went to Dee's house. Dee had the largest library in England at the time, and studied the books that he would later use some of the quotes, some of the plots in his plays, that he actually got these in John Dee's library. And I took that idea and ran with it for my novels.
That's great. You also wrote your Quark novel.
Yes and no.
34th rule of
Yes and no.
acquisition?
I'm being very honest with you. Yes and no.
Oh, tell me.
So, David and I and Eric tried to sell the plot for the 34th Rule, which is the novel you are citing, as an episode on Deep
Mm.
Space Nine. And Ira turned us down, didn't want to buy the episode. When we left the building, David, who had done some writing, and I had already done a series of books called Merchant Prince, David said, why don't we take this idea for an episode and turn it into a Star Trek novel? Eric decided he didn't want to do that. And I said, that's a great idea. And because I had written Merchant Prince series in tandem with two other writers, I thought we would write it in tandem. But lo and behold, David did an excellent job of writing it by himself. However, Eric and I had taken part in layering out the plot line. So we had input into it. I had input into it, but David did the writing. So yes, I had some part of the creation of the 34th Rule, but it's really David's novel.
So, your merchant novels, were they
Merchant
different from
Prince.
the Illyria novels? Pardon me.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, tell me about that
However,
series.
John D is the lead character in my Merchant Prince novels as well.
Okay,
But that John D is totally made up, has nothing to do with reality. He's more
sure.
Quark than the actual John D. And while I was writing the Merchant Prince novels, I swore to the ghost of John D that I would someday write some novels that were very close to what he actually lived through, as opposed to this fantastical Quark D combination that I was writing with two other people. The first novel was with Michael, and the second novel was with Chelsea, and the third novel I wrote by myself. Um, but that was it was more Quark than John D. So we dealt with some interesting issues, but I felt badly that I had not addressed the real life of John D because I was doing research on John D as I was writing the Merchant Prince novels, and felt that I was not doing him that I was doing him a disservice by not writing his actual life.
Well, and D in your merchant novels, though, he is resurrected in a later century, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's all science fiction.
You're right. Yeah.
it's all it's
Oh,
all
I get it.
science fiction. But it had nothing to do with John D. It had more to, as I said, it had more to do with Quark, and that's what they wanted. They wanted me to write about Quark, but just not call him Quark, to call him John D. And Michael is the person who introduced me to John D, and God bless him that he did.
Hmm.
And uh, because I now have volumes and volumes of books about John D sitting to my right here, about John D, and I know a great deal about John D and his writings and his contribution to not only England, but to mathematics, which he was brilliant at, and navigation as well.
Just a couple more things and I'll wrap up. I wanted to know about the fact I didn't know if you follow what Quark has been doing in the Star Trek novels
No, I
post.
don't. I don't.
Oh, because honestly, I think again, I think the writers really love the series, and they did you justice. Well, then I'll move on to first of all, Beauty and the Beast. You know, it's great, Armin, because we got to know you without your makeup in the next TV show I want to briefly ask about. But now you go back and you watch reruns of Beauty and the Beast. It's like, oh, there's Armin. I didn't know he was one of the underworld dwellers and stuff with Vincent. That's great.
Yeah, I was a character called Pascal. I'm very grateful for Beauty and the Beast for many things. One was I had just moved from New York to Los Angeles, and there was a long period of time, I would say 2 years, with relatively little work. I was doing theater work and I was doing commercials, but I could not break into TV to save my life. I did a little here and there, but not very much. But then they cast me in Beauty and the Beast, and I was a recurring character. I think I did about 7 episodes, and I studied what does one do when one works in front of a camera as opposed to working on the stage. And my primary guide was watching Ron Perlman, who played Vincent.
Hmm.
And that was a great education for me. And I was working with wonderful actors, including Roy Dotrice. Roy Dotrice played
Yes,
father. Now, Roy and I had done Shakespeare together at Stratford, and so Roy had become a friend because of Stratford, and unbeknownst to Roy, Roy went to the producers of Beauty and the Beast and said, I'm supposed to be the leader of a community down here, but there's only one other person. And so you have to create new characters for my community so that I have people that I can talk to. And because Roy did that, George R. Martin, who was the showrunner, created other characters, including Pascal, and they cast me as Pascal. And so I got a very good job as a recurring character and a great education learning how to work in front of a camera. And when I was cast as Quark, one of the first phone calls I made was to Ron Perlman and asked him for advice about how to work in that much prosthetics.
sure.
And he wasn't very helpful, but he gave me a wonderful answer, which I've quoted many times. I said, Ron, how do you do it? And he said, Armin, think of the money. Um, and and sometimes I did. Sometimes I did. Although there's another quote that I'd like to cite as well, which is when I was complaining about the makeup to my wife, my brilliant wife, Kitty Swink, said to me, and knew that I was a big Star Trek fan. Uh, my wife said to me, Armin, if you want to be a knight, you have to wear the armor.
Ooh, good.
Yeah, very good.
Very poetic. Absolutely, man. There you go. Tell me about Buffy, because again, man, what a 180 from, well, yeah, 180 from Cork, I would say so. And again,
I would
the
say so.
foil to all these young actors. What was it? Yeah. Tell me about that whole experience, because there weren't a lot of. I mean, there was a couple adults, but really, especially your scenes, you're laying the law down on the students.
Yeah. Now there's a great difference between my relationship with the actors on Buffy on camera and my relationship with the actors off camera. And you've hit it exactly right. On camera, they all despise me. I was a troll to them, and rightfully so. I treated them horribly. At least Snyder treated them
Sure,
off camera, I was indeed a place for them to go to learn more about many things. For instance, they knew that they were going to start going to conventions, so I was a source of information for that.
sure,
They knew that I was on Star Trek. At that point, I'd been on Star Trek for about 4 years, and they wanted to know what it was like as far as out in the public being a science fiction actor. Perhaps more important than anything else, because I was there regularly, but not every day, I became their go-to person to complain about what they didn't like about their characters or about the show, or in the case of Allison Hannigan, about her dates. I was their therapist because Anthony and I were pretty much the oldest people and we weren't old, but we're the
no,
oldest people on the set. And so we were
sure,
dealing with all this 20-year-old angst. And I bonded with all of them and in a great way. And indicative of that, if I may tell this story, um, when they were ready to shoot the last episode, they called me up and said, we would love for you to come to the last day of work. And by this time, my character, Snyder, had been dead for at least 3 seasons. And I was flattered by that. And I expected, while having watched the show, that there would be tens, dozens, hundreds of recurring actors there and crew people there. And so I thought that it'll be a big picture, not, and I'll be one of the people. And when I got there were only four of us.
wow,
Um, and we took the picture. I said goodbye to all my friends on Buffy. And as I was walking back to my car, I just happened to be walking with Joss Whedon. And I told him I expected a lot more people here today. Why is it that you chose the four of us? And he very graciously said, you're the only four that all of us liked.
wow, crazy, man. Who
And
were the
and
other
when you
three?
consider what my character was like, that's a great compliment indeed.
Yeah, but again, playing the villain and playing it well, there's something to say for that. Do you remember the other three that were with you?
Christine, who's Buffy's mom, was
Oh,
there.
sure, of
One
course.
of the three guys in the later seasons, in the last season, that were sort of nerds, and they were Buffy's antithesis.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
and I can't remember which of the three was there. And the fourth one was not an actor at all. He was the DP who had worked there with me and moved on to other things during the run of Buffy, and he had replaced himself. So it was just the four of us, and then of course the cast and crew of Buffy on their last day of work.
That's great. Well, to wrap up, I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about the charity that you and your wife
Thank you.
you two established this, correct? This
We did
organization.
with Jonathan Frakes. It's called Trek Against Pancreatic Cancer. Unfortunately, and now it's expanded to John Billingsley and Juan Carlos Cotto, who's Manny Cotto's brother.
Yeah,
Uh, each of us have had losses, except for Kitty and I. Well, we have too, but not in the same way. Uh, have had losses because of pancreatic cancer. Manny Cotto, who was the showrunner for Enterprise, died of pancreatic cancer. So Juan Carlos lost his brother. Jonathan Frakes lost his brother to pancreatic cancer early on. John Billingsley lost his mother to pancreatic cancer. And Kitty, of course, my wife, is a survivor of pancreatic cancer. And we've lost a lot of friends who we've met through PanCan. That's the organization we help support,
sure.
um, to pancreatic cancer. And we have all become ambassadors for PanCan, trying to get people to be aware of the service, to contribute to the service, take advantage of the service. And if anybody out there is listening, if anyone has a friend, a family member who is diagnosed with this disease, I advocate immediately. You must contact PanCan for several reasons. One, they can steer you to the best doctors in your region. It's a national organization, a huge national organization, and is very much aware of who are the best doctors in your region. Not every doctor is capable of dealing with pancreatic cancer. Now, it's not just the patients. The caregivers, the people who surround the patient, also need to be looked after, and how to deal with their family member or their friend or their spouse having this kind of cancer. And um, and so they also help take care of the caregivers as well. And one of the great things that they do, the contributions that we on Trek Against Pancreatic Cancer collect for PanCan, most of that goes to research to help get rid of this disease. And I'm happy to say that when Kitty was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the survival rate was only 3%. Kitty
Wow,
beat those odds. But
wow.
because of PanCan's efforts, it has now risen to 13%. It is still not a very good number, but it's exponentially bigger than it was at 3%. And we, of course, want to see this rise all the way to 100%. We want there to be a cure for this disease. And the only way to get a cure for this disease is to sponsor research in the cure. And this is what PanCan does. And every year in April, we have something called Purple Stride, where in this year, 65 cities around the country, people gathered to stride for the cure against pancreatic cancer. And we are humbled by the work that PanCan does. And I'm sure that the five of us and everybody else who joins us will do this until our last days.
That's great. So pancan.org, would I assume
That's
that's the
right.
correct?
Pancan.org. If you want to know more about the organization, go to pancan.org and you can find out more about the organization. But come the springtime, the us and other helpers, but Trek Against Pancreatic Cancer will be asking for donations for the very things I was just talking about.
That's great. You guys did an online, didn't you do a Zoom where everybody was on and
That's right. Yeah, we often do Zooms. We're trying to figure out ways to get more people involved in knowing about the research projects that we're helping to support, and also knowing about the organization. When Kitty and Jonathan's brother were diagnosed, and even Manny Cotto, and because that was, I guess, the most recent of the five of us. None of us knew about PanCan, and we wish we had. We wish we had. PanCan's been around for, I think, more than 25, 30 years now.
Wow. Well, it's great work, and I'm glad you're doing it. We're looking forward to seeing you at Terrificon in less than 2 weeks at Mohegan Sun in Connecticut, and I will have the pleasure of moderating a Deep Space Nine panel with yourself and Nana and Andrew as well. So very
Yeah,
excited about
we're looking forward to doing that. It should be a great fun. I will be the quiet one because those two guys know much more than I do.
it. I'm going to get a few more things out of you, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of fans that'll have a lot of questions for you. Armin, you've been incredibly kind with your time. I really, really appreciate you coming on. And it's been my pleasure to have this conversation with you. And I look forward to the next one that we have in about 2 weeks.
Thank you, John. Looking forward to seeing you in person.